Welcome to Genetics Decoded. I'm Sharon Palmer, your host. Please note that the information in this podcast is for general information only and is not to be considered medical advice. What we're going to cover today is lactose intolerance. We're going to have an in-depth look at how genetics will allow us to screen for lactose intolerance and understand what we need to do about it. Today we're going to have an in-depth look at lactose intolerance. Dairy is one of those areas I see clinically that there's a lot of confusion. People, if they think they're reacting to dairy, they make the assumption that they're lactose intolerant, and that will lead to them either completely removing dairy, or what they'll do is they'll move over to lactose-free. But it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. It's very important when you're assessing how you're reacting to dairy is to find out whether you're actually lactose intolerant, whether you have a cow's milk allergy, which means that you'll be reacting to the proteins in cow's milk, and whether you're reacting to casein, which is the predominant protein. And you need to know all of those three before you can make a really informed decision around what you're going to do. And when it comes to any kind of food intolerance, I think it's very important that you, especially when we're removing these key food groups, is that we've got to be cautious about doing that because there's always pros and cons. And the thing I hear a lot about lactose or about dairy is that it's just bad for everyone. I hear over and over again that the only people that should be drinking milk are baby cows. And so I think, there's a lot of vilification out there around dairy. And what I want to do today is really clarify how you can go in and determine whether you are lactose intolerant and then make informed and educated decisions around what you're going to do. From a genetic perspective, being lactose tolerant is considered one of the biggest evolutionary advantages that we know of to date. So this is why I think we've got to be incredibly cautious about saying dairy is just bad for everybody, because it's actually not. What you want to know is, do you have to remove it? Because there will be some risk factors associated with being lactose intolerant. But if you are actually lactose tolerant, there are some significant benefits to that. And if we look genetically how this came to be, this change in our ability to digest lactose happened about 10,000 years ago. And it came into being as we began to domesticate our animals. So suddenly we had these animals, we were milking them, and the genetic shift was that some people retained the ability to break down lactose, because the norm here is that most of the world's population are lactose intolerant. About 75%, so 3 out of 4 people are lactose intolerant, but 1 out of 4 people is actually lactose tolerant. So the norm was that post-weaning, we began to, the production of the enzyme lactase began to decline and eventually switch off. The shift in the gene is as we started to have access to a different food group, the body stopped switching off its production of lactase and it continued to make it. And this is where we should be a little bit careful with our terminology. Rather than calling people lactose intolerant, we should be really asking, are people lactase persistent? Do they retain the ability to make that lactose? And so this is what your genetics can go in and look at, is to tell you whether you've got that capacity moving into adulthood, the ability to continue to make that enzyme. If we go in and look at the genetics here, it's really important to understand the role of ethnicity here. So when we look at Caucasians, there's key genes that we want to look at, but if you are African, you need to go in and assess different genes. And this is where it's really important when you're making a decision around a genetic test is it going to give you the information that you need? What I do know is most companies out there putting genetic testing into the market are only reporting on the genes around Caucasians being lactose tolerant. So you need to exercise a little bit of caution there. So if we have a look at what it actually means here. So if we look at, talking about lactose intolerant, what is lactose? So lactose is the sugar molecule that we find in dairy. And lactose will be across all dairy, so whether it's cow's milk or sheep's milk or goat's milk or camel's milk, there'll be a certain amount of lactose in them. The amount of lactose can vary across those different animals, and this is why, something like goat's milk will have less, and why some people feel that they may tolerate that a little bit better. If you need to break down lactose, you need to be able to produce the enzyme called lactase. What that does is it allows you to break it down and you release something called glucose and galactose into the body. Now, when we're children, when we're babies, it's very important to be able to produce this enzyme because, we're babies and we're living on mother's milk. If we can't break it down, that's kind of incredibly significant. So what we see is that the production of this enzyme lactase peaks at birth and then it begins to decline, and for the majority of the world's population, by the time we're around 3 or 4, maybe even the age of 7, it begins to switch off. In the people who are lactase persistent, the body continues to produce that enzyme. Now, it's not actually the lactase gene that we're looking at here. There's another gene called MC-M6, and this has total control over the lactase gene. And it is really the variants in the MC-M6 gene that make all the difference. Now, in people who retain the ability to produce lactase, that MC-M6 continues to allow the gene to produce lactase. In people who are lactose intolerant, the lactase gene switches off and can no longer produce this enzyme. That's really what a genetic test is reporting on. If you're unable to break down lactose, you can end up with a lot of symptoms from a clinical point of view. One of the most common is that we end up with these gut symptoms. Very common for people to be very, very bloated. And in people who are lactose intolerant, that can almost happen within an hour or 2 of them consuming lactose. It can lead to diarrhea. It can even lead to constipation in somebody, but for a lot of people there are some obvious gut symptoms, but not for everybody. We know that gut symptoms can be a major risk factor around being lactose intolerant. It is really common for a lot of people to experience bloating. This can happen within 1 to 2 hours of consuming foods that have lactose in them. But we also know that there's a number of people who get no obvious gut symptoms. And these are the people who actually find it harder to figure out what's going on with their health, because a lot of people can end up with diarrhea, but just as many people can end up with constipation. So if you're lactose intolerant and you can't break down this lactose, what happens is that lactose ends up going into the large intestines. It doesn't belong there. Your gut bacteria begin to ferment it and produce all of this gas. And so that's where the bloating comes from. But it also can lead to issues around constipation and around diarrhea. But the extent of the impact on the body is not just from a gut point of view. Very strong tie into risk around things like allergies, asthma, skin conditions. So if you're experiencing gut issues or you've got skin issues, you really do want to go in and screen whether lactose intolerance is a player for you. But again, the impact is more broad. We're starting to see impacts from a neurological point of view, from a cognitive point of view, from a mental health point of view. And this is because some inflammatory cytokines, some triggers around the immune system can cross the blood-brain barrier. So this is again where people go, oh, I get a headache, or I get brain fog, or I can't seem to focus. Again, those can be signs of lactose intolerance. We can see issues around musculoskeletal fallout. So again, if you're getting aches and pains, you want to go in and assess that. But we see that people who are lactose intolerant, especially if they've been getting obvious gut symptoms, they've already kind of naturally gravitated away from dairy or high lactose foods. But we see that people, when they do that, they start to have some issues around, not getting enough calcium in their diet. They start to have lower vitamin D levels. So as we change our food choices, we can change our risks around our nutrient load as well. Now, we know that there's a lot of issues around being lactose intolerant. But there's also some real benefits if you have the ability to break down lactose. This is why you want to be very cautious about just removing it from your diet. There are some real benefits around the gut microbiome, especially around the levels of bifidobacteria, which is one of your keystone species. People who are lactose tolerant and consuming lactose tend to have much better levels of bifidobacteria, which then have a range of benefits in the body, from how our immune system works, how we lose weight, our weight maintenance. So this is where you can see that domino effect through the body. If there's some real benefits and you remove that food, you start to remove these benefits as well. We see that lactose, particularly as we break it down into galactose, can have real benefits around our immune system. In young children, that galactose is really playing a role in developing the brain. And this is where I really caution people. It's one thing as an adult to be removing these key food groups, but when you're removing food groups from children, you have to be very mindful of the nutrients that you're removing or the impact. And if your genetics determines that that's something that you need to do, then you want to follow through on that. But you also need to make sure that these nutrient requirements are being met in other ways as well. When we talk about lactose-free foods, so if you go into any supermarket now or you go to any cafe, there's always this lactose-free milk, lactose-free cheese, yogurts. The list is quite extensive. A lot of people assume that lactose-free has had the lactose removed, but that is actually not the case. What happens is at a commercial level, your manufacturer will use some commercial enzymes. They will either be from fungus or they'll be from yeast, and what will happen is they will be added into the raw product. And so that breakdown of lactose happens at the manufacturing stage, whereas if you were having milk with lactose in it and you produced the enzyme lactase, that would happen within your digestive tract upon digestion. So to just know that lactose-free is actually not lactose-free. It just means that breakdown has already occurred. It's also the reason that if any of you have tried any lactose-free milk, it's often much sweeter. And some people find that a little bit confronting. It maybe is too sweet, but that's because that breakdown into glucose has already occurred. There's a lot of talk about how to manage that sweetness, but that's really the reason, is that breakdown into glucose and galactose has already occurred in the product. From a food standard perspective, for a food to be called lactose-free, it has to have at least 90% of the lactose broken down. And so, again, it's not truly lactose-free. And this is where you want to be a little careful if you truly are lactose intolerant. The good news about being lactose intolerant, it's not something that you have to remove 100%. A lot of people can tolerate some amount of lactose, and that really varies from individual to individual. What I always recommend at a clinic level, if you find out that you are lactose intolerant, it's good to completely remove it so everything can begin to settle down, and then to kind of start to challenge yourself with introducing a little bit of lactose. We know that the type of dairy that you choose can make a difference. So I had mentioned earlier that things like goat's milk have less lactose than cow's milk. We know that things like hard cheeses will have very little lactose compared to soft cheeses. So again, there's choices that you can make. But what I've seen when I've gone through this process with people is that for some people, when they try and introduce some lactose-free products back into their diet, they just don't like the way that they're feeling. They feel that they still are reacting. But, this allows you to go, can I tolerate some, or am I better off without it completely? And that will be very, very individual. You will often see too in things like pharmacies and chemists, there'll be something called Lactase or Dairy Ease is often what you can buy over the counter. Again, are these commercial enzymes. And what you would do is you would take them, maybe 30 minutes or, maybe you went out and had an ice cream and you shouldn't have, is that you can pop one of these enzymes, and what it does, it will support your body breaking it down. Again, the type of enzyme that's being used will determine its efficacy. And again, a lot of people do not respond particularly well. But as an individual, you almost need to go through that process and work out what you need. But to know that being lactose intolerant does not mean an absolute blanket removal. It's good to be able to have a little bit of flexibility in your diet, and you'll just need to work out for you what that would need to be. One of the things that we need to be mindful of is when we're using our genetics to identify whether we're lactose intolerant or not, is to be able to differentiate between what we call primary lactose intolerance and secondary lactose intolerance. So most of the people who are having issues around lactose, not being able to digest it, will have this primary lactose intolerance. This is where, at a genetic level, you're no longer being able to make that enzyme called lactase. But we know for a lot of people, especially people who have got inflammatory bowel issues, so things like celiac disease, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, they can end up having secondary lactose intolerance, is that they're still capable of producing the enzyme, but there's other factors that are happening that are causing them to not be able to break it down and digest it very well. And again, this is where genetic testing can really clearly identify that. Because if you don't use genetic testing to identify whether you're lactose intolerant, you've got a number of options. You can kind of either do the guesswork, which is just like, I seem to eat some dairy and I react, so obviously I'm lactose intolerant. That certainly has some risks, not overly accurate. You could do what's called a hydrogen breath test. So this is often what's done through the medical system. You will go and digest some lactose, and then they're going to measure the amount of hydrogen that is produced, and from that they will determine whether you're lactose intolerant or not. The problem with that test is there's quite a number of false negatives and false positives. There can be some issues around generating a lot of uncomfortable symptoms through that process. And up until having genetic testing available to us, these were the things that people often had to go through. And this is why it can be cumbersome to work out. But your genetic test will make the process incredibly easy and also much more accurate as well. And it's the only way that you could really differentiate between having that primary or that secondary form. When a genetic test reports on lactose intolerance, the genetic test is often colour-coded, and this is where you need to be very cautious, because the assumption is that the variant in the gene is the risk factor. But with dairy, it is actually the opposite. With lactose, it's the opposite. So we know that the norm is to be lactose intolerant. The genetic variant, the change, was to enable us to continue to produce this enzyme and be lactase persistent. I see a number of practitioners, because What we know is that genetic testing is very new to the market. So people don't have extensive use. There's not extensive training in this field. And so it opens up the door to misinterpretation or simply misunderstanding. I know of a nutritionist, a dietitian actually here in Australia, who started to just use some raw genetic reporting, which is this colour coding. And so you look at it and you go, okay, if someone has a green, it means that it's a positive, and if somebody has a red, it's a negative. But on a genetic test, being lactose intolerant will actually show up as the green. Being lactose tolerant or lactose persistent will show up as the red. So I started to see a number of patients who had seen this particular dietitian telling me, I'm lactose intolerant. And when I'd go back in and look at their genetics, I'd go, no, you're actually the opposite. You're lactose tolerant, not intolerant. And so this is where you want to be really, really careful around the interpretation of genetic data. Colour coding does not always tell you exactly what's going on. You need to make sure you get it right, or you end up doing the complete opposite. So in this case, you start removing all of this lactose, you start to lose some of the benefits, you actually don't need to do it, but on the flip side, you have all of these people who are actually lactose intolerant being told the opposite. So just be mindful of that. A lot of practitioners, if they're not careful, they don't realise that they're reporting the wrong information. In summary, what I want you to know is that going in and finding out whether you're lactose intolerant is important at a clinical point of view. You don't want to screen lactose intolerance in isolation. You also really want to look at whether you've got a cow's milk allergy or you're reacting to casein. And there's very few companies out there who are reporting around cow's milk and casein. They are only reporting around lactose, so it doesn't often give you the right amount of information in order to know how to make those changes to your diet. So make sure you get a much better look, and then know that you don't have to completely remove your lactose. It's about working, and with trial and error and trying to see exactly what happens. Thank you so much for listening to Genetics Decoded. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to subscribe, like and share. Tell your friends all about what we're doing, because we truly are individuals. Your genetic data can be used for you to make much better decisions around your diet, supplements and lifestyle. Join me each week to find out how.